How are you in a crisis? Some people are just as cool as the other side of the pillow. And one of the people who is like that is my father. Some of you know this story when on a Thanksgiving dinner, my younger brother, I sitting next to me, I noticed him tearing a hole in this paper napkin of his. Remember this? He was trying to figure out if he could put it over a lit candle without catching the napkin on fire. And as it turned out, he couldn't. And all of a sudden, his napkin is on fire, and we're all sitting around the Thanksgiving table, and people start to panic, as you normally do when there's fire. And my mom screams, "Don't drop it on the tablecloth," because that's her good tablecloth. She doesn't want it to burn it. And she's not worried about his hand. She's worried about the tablecloth, of course. And somebody else, so he kind of turns away, and somebody else says, "Don't drop it on the carpet, because you're going to ruin this carpet." So he's running for the bathroom. Somebody else is calling 911, and other people are just kind of running in circles, screaming, as you're supposed to do in a crisis. And when the whole thing ended, and the thing was put into the sink and the fire was out, I look over, and my father has not missed a bite of his Thanksgiving dinner. He's just sitting down there eating and looking around, and everybody sat down, and all was quiet. He just looks up, and he says 3 words. He just says, "My idiot son." And then he keeps eating. That was it. And I don't know how you are in a crisis, but some people panic and go crazy, and other people are just real cool in a crisis. We would prefer that we don't have crisis. We would prefer that we don't have any problems, but problems come our way. 50 years ago, there was a newspaper that had this brilliant idea to increase their circulation. What they did was they offered this little insurance policy to people. They said, for every new subscriber, we're going to give you a $50 insurance policy so that if you ever get injured, you'll get your $50 back. So basically it works like this. You pay $50 to subscribe to the newspaper for a full year. And if any time you ever get an injury, they're going to give you $50 back. So it's this nice little insurance policy. So a number of people signed up for it. And the first time that somebody got injured, they took out a full-page ad in the paper to show how the policy worked and that they paid it out. And this is what they wrote in the paper that day. They said, "Yesterday, a new subscriber who had received our new insurance policy fell from a bus and broke his leg in 2 places. He lost 4 teeth, he dislocated his jaw, he sustained a head laceration that required 18 stitches. For this, he received an immediate payment of $50. And then it said, "Subscribe today, and tomorrow you may be the lucky one." See, I don't want to be that lucky. We don't want to have accidents and problems and crises, but somehow they have a way of finding us. When they do, the question is, how are you going to handle it when the crisis comes? When Jesus talked about the storms that are going to come, and he didn't say if the storm comes, he says when the storm comes, and that comes to all of us. I want you to watch how Paul reacted in a crisis situation in Acts 27. We've been studying his life, and we have seen his great faith and how last week we saw how joyful he was in the midst of prison after he had been beaten and everything. We saw how he still was joyful and worshiped God in difficult circumstances. But today I want you to see his courage in a life-threatening situation. And we're going to find this in Acts chapter 27. Basically, to set the stage, Paul is a prisoner, and he's being taken to Rome to stand trial. And if this trial doesn't go right, he will be killed. So his life is on the line. And he is traveling to Rome on a corn ship. This was a massive ship that was designed to haul tons and tons of grain. It was big and it was bulky and it was hard to steer, but they occasionally took passengers on as well. And in this case, they took on 276 passengers. Some of them were sailors who were just there to get the grain to the next location, but some of them were prisoners, and others were soldiers who were there to guard the prisoners. 276 were on the ship, and they were about to face a killer storm. Like the perfect storm, if you saw the movie, is about to hit these guys in this ship. And we're going to start in Acts 27 in verse 9, where we read, "Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was the Day of Atonement. Let me explain. The Day of Atonement, now we call it Yom Kippur. It took place in late September or early October. Now, in the Mediterranean in those days, by November, all sailing ceased because the conditions were so dangerous, no sailor would go out into the Mediterranean in November. In September and October, it got real dicey. And Paul is looking at this time, has enough sailing experience to know that they would be foolish to leave port right now in September, October, because they're going to run into bad weather. It's almost a certainty. Well, let's see what happens. Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives as well." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. There was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. So what happened right there is that the soldiers and the sailors, you see, they were driven by profit and by convenience. So they didn't listen to Paul, but they listened to the captain of the ship, who said, "I think we can make it to the next port. It's a better place for us to harbor there for the winter." The sailors wanted to deliver the grain and get their paycheck. The soldiers wanted to deliver their prisoners and get this over with, so they just ignored Paul's advice and they moved forward. There's two lessons, by the way, right here. One is, it's dangerous to ignore godly advice. If a godly person gives you advice, listen carefully to what they're saying, because they ignored that, and instead they listened to godless men. And soon they would learn to listen to Paul, but at this time they ignored it. The second lesson here is that the majority are not always right. So just because the majority of people think it's a good idea doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. In verse 13, he continues the journey. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called a nor'easter, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. They had calm breezes, and very quickly the calm breezes turned into hurricane force winds. It's the same thing that happens in our lives. Our lives can very quickly go from being nice and calm to being in this raging storm. It can happen with a doctor's visit. It can happen with a phone call in the middle of the night. And all of a sudden, that calm, peaceful life of ours is thrown into chaos. And for these people, their calm little journey was suddenly a nightmare. Verse 16 said, "As we passed to the lee of a small island called Clauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together." I have no idea physically how they could do this, but they wrapped ropes around the hull of the ship itself and tried to bind it together so it wouldn't break apart. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. That's a terrible thing that just happened there in verse 20. They lost all hope. They were being driven toward the Syrtis Sands. It's right off the coast of North Africa, and it was the graveyard of many a ship. Once they hit those sandbars, the ship would break apart and all those people would die. And they knew it was there, and they were heading for it, and there was nothing they could do to change the direction because the wind was blowing them, and they couldn't control the ship at all. So they began to throw the cargo overboard. You know, possessions are are very valuable to us when things are good. But in a crisis, possessions become utterly worthless. This ship was taking on water, and it was going to sink. And so anything that added weight to the ship, they threw it overboard. It didn't matter how valuable it was. They just got rid of it because it was just going to contribute to their sinking. There was a story that came from the Titanic when that ship was going down about a woman who had come out and was getting in line to get on one of the lifeboats when suddenly she remembered something she forgot, and she went running back to her room. And she ran through the casino. It was like a shortcut to her room. She ran through this room that had been used as a casino. And at this point, there was already water in that room, and there was money floating all over this place, $100 bills floating everywhere. And she didn't bother to stop and pick up any of those. Can you imagine that? $100 bills everywhere, and she didn't even bother to pick up one, because what she wanted was in her room. And she ran back to her room, and she wasn't looking for some diamond or some possession that was so valuable to her. There were 2 oranges that were on the shelf, and she knew that might help her to survive. And she grabbed these 2 oranges, and she ran back through the casino with all of that money floating around and got on one of those ships. Our values suddenly changed dramatically in a time of a crisis as to what's valuable and what's not valuable. And for these people, all the stuff that was on that ship had no value at all, and they began to throw it overboard. It said here they lost hope. They gave up all hope of being saved. Have you ever lost hope? It's another word for it is despair. Have you ever felt despair? This sense that all is lost and there is no hope at all. It's a terrible, terrible feeling. And these men experienced it. Some of you have experienced it in the past, and some of you may experience it in the future. It's a terrible feeling to give up hope. They said that over one of the concentration camps there was a sign that said, "Abandon all hope here." For all those prisoners, as they walked into that concentration camp, that was the message to them. Abandon all hope. You give up all hope when you walk in here. When I was up in Boston, the Red Sox hadn't won the World Series in 98 years, and some people thought about putting that sign over Fenway Park, "Abandon all hope here," but things have changed a bit there. In the Los Angeles airport, there is a huge sign that says, "Keep hope alive." I don't know who put it up, but it's an amazing sign. Keep hope alive. That was Paul's mission with these men. He saw that they had given up all hope, and his mission, as a prisoner, by the way, as a prisoner on the ship, his mission was to keep their hope alive. And I want you to see what he did here in all of this darkness. Remember, it said the sun or the moon hadn't shined in days. They had been in darkness, and all hope had left them. And watch what Paul does to give these men hope in verse 21. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself from the damage and loss." He couldn't resist saying, "I told you so." So even Paul couldn't resist. In verse 22, he says, "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me.'" These are words of hope. He gave them words of hope that not one of them was going to be lost. And hope changes everything. You can have people in a hopeless situation like these men were, and if you can give them hope, everything changes. There was a man named Eugene Land who was a self-made millionaire, lived in New York. And he was asked to come speak to a group of 6th graders. And he thought, what can I say to 59 6th graders who were in East Harlem, where the dropout rate was astronomical? Maybe 10% of these kids would even graduate high school. What can I say to them that's going to make a difference? And when he stood before these kids and he saw the despair in their eyes, just no hope in any of their lives for their future, he said this to them. He said, stay in school. Stay in school. He said, if you stay in school, if you graduate from this school, I will help pay the college tuition for every one of you. At that moment, the lives of those 59 sixth graders changed. One student said, I had something to look forward to, something waiting for me. She said it was a golden feeling that I had something to look forward to. And in the end, 90% of those kids graduate high school because he gave them hope. Paul, his mission is to give these men hope. He's a prisoner, but he's giving the others hope. He became the captain. He probably said, I am the captain now. I would have if I was him. He became the captain because he's the only one who had the courage to keep going. Everybody else had given up. And even as a prisoner, he took the opportunity to witness to these men about the power of God and the power of Jesus Christ. I have to say that I don't know many people today who are bold witnesses for Jesus Christ. There's not a whole lot of people who fall into that category, unfortunately. Years ago, there was a man named Henry Hines, and you know him because of his ketchup and his beans. But Henry Hines was also a Christian. I don't know if you knew that. He was a Christian. But for much of his life, he was kind of a silent Christian, one of those undercover Christians. He was a Christian, but just didn't let anybody else know about it. And one day he went to church like he did every Sunday, and there was a guest speaker there who knew who he was, and he knew how successful he had been in business and how much energy he had poured into this business of his. And this guest minister had the audacity to confront him about it and said, with all of your energy for business, why aren't you doing more for Christ? Can you imagine? And Henry Hines was angry, and he went home from church and he was mad about that, but he couldn't sleep that night. And finally, at 4 o'clock in the morning, he woke up and he asked God to make him, so much for the new mic, huh? He asked God to make him a bold witness for Jesus Christ at 4 in the morning. A short time later, he was at this meeting, and everybody at this conference were bank presidents. And he turned to the man next to him, and he told him how he could be saved. And the man looked back at Henry Hines, and he said, I wondered why you've never said anything about that to me all these years, because I knew you were a Christian. I wondered why you never said anything to me about it. And that man was the first man that Henry Hines ever led to Christ. He was the first of 267 men that Henry Hines would lead to Christ. He became a bold witness for Christ because he was confronted. Why aren't you telling people about this? Paul was a bold witness for Christ. And in the midst of this near-death experience, he tells them about his God. I wonder how many of those sailors and soldiers would eventually give their lives to Jesus Christ because of Paul. But now you have to hear the rest of the story. So we're going to skip ahead to verse 39 and see what happens to the ship. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay and a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. It's a miracle. I mean, this ship broke apart at sea, and every person, many of those days didn't know how to swim, but every person made it to land safely. That's exactly what God told him was going to happen. He says, I've not only spared your life, but I'm going to spare the lives of all the sailors with you and everybody else on that ship. And then God fulfilled that promise, and every one of them reached land safely. The great lesson there is that for every one of you and every one of us, we will go through some storms. And there are going to be some bad storms that are come along. There are going to be some storms that are come along who are going to be life-threatening storms. And every one of us will go through them. And one of the great lessons of this passage is God will take you through the storm. And He'll bring you out the other side. And He will always be with you. He will never leave you. And He will never forsake you. God is our certain hope. That hope that is being certain of what you cannot see. God is our certain hope. Paul was the only one who had that hope, and he gave that hope to others. We need to be the bearers of that message today. We're on this gigantic ship that is heading for disaster, and we are the ones who know the living God. We have that hope inside of us. Those who have Christ, those who have the Holy Spirit living inside of us, we have that certain hope in us. But we cannot keep it to ourselves. You have neighbors who don't have any hope. You have family members that don't have any hope. You know people at work and people where you go to school who don't have any hope. You cannot keep that message to yourself. And don't say to yourself, it's because we're in the midst of this crisis, I'm too busy now to share my faith with other people. This is the perfect time, as Paul discovered. And the perfect time to share your faith with others is in the midst of the crisis. Your crisis and their crisis. This is the time to tell them about the living God, and the time to tell them that you know a God who is bigger than the storm. You know a God who can still the storm with a word, and you know a God who is going to be with you and take you through the storm. This is the time to become bold witnesses for Christ. So maybe I need to give you the message that this guest preacher gave to Henry Hines. Why aren't you more active for Christ? Why aren't you more active in telling people about Christ? And I'm sorry if it makes you angry, but maybe that's the message God wants to hear for every one of us, me included. To say, there are people around you who need to hear this. Let's not keep that good news to ourselves. Let's tell everybody we see. Let's pray together and ask for God's help with that, okay?